Hello, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of Virtually, Nemensa's free virtual web accessibility and digital inclusion conference. I'd like to say a massive thanks to Alistair Duggan, Marley Fernando and Adi Latif and Bryce Johnson for their excellent talks yesterday. And today we got talks from Nemensa's Joel Strohmeier, the accessibility team at the Ministry of Justice, and Laurie Samuels of NBC Universal. My Clear Text are providing live captions, which you can access through Zoom, or alternatively, we have provided a stream text link in the chat, which I'll just drop in now. And that way you can get a fully adjustable page of captions. Also, all sessions are going to be recorded and available online shortly after the conference. First up, though, we have Joel Strohmeier, Senior Accessibility Consultant here at Nemensa. And Joel's going to be discussing his time working in accessibility and inclusion in collaboration with NHS Test and Trace, the lessons learned, challenges faced, and the importance of inclusive health services. Please do get involved in the discussion in the chat. Make sure your settings are switched to panelists and attendees. That way everyone can see your messages. And if you've got any questions for Joel, please do submit them using the Q&A box. And I'll get through as many as I can at the end. So yeah, over to you, Joel, to kick things off.
Thank you, Henry. Pleasure to be speaking with you all today. As Henry's mentioned there, my talk focuses on my experience working on accessibility and inclusion as part of the Test and Trace program. And I'm going to chat a little bit about some of the lessons that I learned and, as mentioned, my overall experience during this time. I'm very much hoping there are a few things that you can take away from it today. So a little bit about my current role. As mentioned, I'm a senior accessibility consultant here at Nemensa. In terms of my background, I've had previous roles in digital marketing, operations and transformation roles across largely financial services and energy sector. And while preparing this talk, I realized that a theme of my past work is having worked on user-friendly and accessible website rebrand and rebuild projects. I also worked on the creation of some style guides and pattern libraries. And those second two bits of experience in particular were invaluable for my time on Test and Trace. And it should become clear as I go through the talk how useful that experience was. If I start just by giving a sort of talk outline for today, I'm going to start with a summary. So we'll look at some key terminology and definitions. I'll talk a bit about the context and environment, and then we'll look at team structure and a little bit about the team purpose. Then we'll get into the challenges that were faced, a few things that went well, a couple of things, or I should say a few things again that didn't go so well, the key lessons learned, and then as Henry's already mentioned, we'll hopefully have some time for questions at the end as well. So if I start then with a summary of the program itself. If you haven't heard the term Test and Trace, it was the name for a key part of the government response to COVID-19 pandemic in England. I noticed actually quite a few times recently people have still been using the term track and trace, which I thought was quite interesting and shows how well that initial term stuck in people's minds. But it was changed to Test and Trace around the time that I joined. The response to the pandemic crossed both the physical and digital worlds. You'll, of course, most likely remember that we had social distancing measures introduced, a whole load of physical test sites that were being built across the country. But of course, we also had a large number of digital services created, such as the ability to book a COVID vaccination online. And while my remit was to support both the physical and digital, my main focus for today's talk is how I supported on those digital aspects of Test and Trace. If we start by thinking about the context, well, nothing like this had happened before in mine or most people's lifetimes, and it meant that pretty much all the challenges that it would take organizations up to decades to face happened almost straight away in the context of test and trace. And you might notice that I'm avoiding the term unprecedented here quite consciously. One thing I sort of have to admit is I shamefully remember going for a meal with some friends in Bristol, many of whom actually were nurses, and discussing with them that perhaps this might not be such a serious event, and maybe it'd even be resolved in a few months. And of course, now I know quite how wrong I was. To address such a serious situation, one of the central challenges for the government was how to make sure that enough people were getting vaccinated and following all the related guidance. And to ensure this, they needed to make this process as efficient as possible and to remove as many barriers to the services that it could. But if we go back in time a little, in 2010, the Government Digital Service, or GDS as it's often known, had already been created to overhaul a whole host of public services. They looked to replace old technologies with new and applying user-focused principles to make life easier for people interacting with the government, be that central or local. GDS revolutionized how to build services which were simple and quick to use, and they codified this approach online. They created guidance on how user-centered teams should be structured for success, how to fund these teams, how teams should write, design, and build things in code. This was all distilled into various online resources, and this is also now looked at across the world as a leading example of digital transformation in government. And I mention this because the work GDS had already done provided a basis upon which test and trace could build, meaning that my team and various colleagues didn't have to start completely from scratch. Coming back to test and trace specifically, how do you ensure that all citizens in the UK can access critical health services? Well, we needed to make sure that we improve the experience of using health services across the board, of course. But we also had to address specific barriers for some core groups. And these were essentially those people who would be disproportionately affected by COVID itself. For example, what would the impact be for users with disabilities, people with no fixed address, people lacking the time or money to interact with and benefit from services? And of course, we need to consider how race, religion, or gender, for example, may also affect the ability to these same health services. Now, I've mentioned already a few different types of barrier that users might face, but I want to cover some more specific examples that my team concentrated on. So some examples include users not understanding the language that information is provided in. English might not be the user's first language, of course. There was also research to suggest that there might be a lack of trust or confidence in what was deemed to be official information. Digital literacy or confidence using computers and smartphones was a potential barrier. Accessibility barriers, such as online forms not being usable for people using assistive technology, which translates on-screen information into audible announcements, such as screen reading technology. And another one being a lack of money or time to complete tasks. So with some of those examples of barriers in mind, I'm going to look a bit more closely at at my team's specific structure and our purpose, and how we were set up to remove some of these barriers. Now, in response to this challenge, the United Kingdom Health Security Agency, or UKHSA, set up an inclusive design team within which I sat, and it was a team of inclusion specialists sat centrally in UKHSA, but which teams across the programme more widely could call upon for support and technical guidance when they were designing and building these health services. And our team structure was made up of user researchers, And they were there to help us understand our users, to run research programs, to help us to identify improvements or changes to services. Then we had content designers, and they were there to optimize what was communicated in services, how best to communicate, and where. We had service designers, and they looked at framing, mapping, using systems thinking, and generally collaborating on how these services would work end-to-end and holistically. We had accessibility specialists, so that was me and a couple of my close colleagues. And we focused on identifying and removing barriers to both interfaces and the services more broadly, but also to guide people towards considering inclusion throughout their design and build. And this was just the UK HSA team. So further afield, I worked with interaction designers, product and service owners, and a whole host of other disciplines across various departments and agencies. We've looked at context and structure. Now let's just take a quick look at the overarching objective. And this was to create health equity by improving the inclusivity and accessibility of health services, which kind of sums up a lot of what I've mentioned already. It was quite an ambitious objective. What it boils down to is it's all about people and making sure that people could access critical health services irrespective of their ability or identity. And it was about recognizing that certain groups may need different types of support to access services than others. So at this point, we've covered a fair bit of ground actually already. We've looked at a summary of the test and trace program, some of the definitions and terminology, how the team worked and its structure and purpose. Now I'd like to look a little bit more practically, very briefly, at what I did day to day, just to give a flavor of the work. So on the screen, I'm showing an example of a test and trace service prototype with the Chrome Developer Tools window sat on top, which is showing a kind of preview of the page code. And this was a pretty common look in terms of my workspace day to day. And as I mentioned, I'd done a little bit of front-end development and supported with various website releases in the past. So I was in quite a good position to help with some of those technical code-related matters. But in addition to reviewing code, I also reviewed the words and content that colleagues in content design were working on. I provided feedback on static designs, interactive prototypes that were being created. I spent quite a lot of time providing guidance on processes and tools, and also the standards that teams needed to work towards. And then tried to collate all of this into outputs that could be put in a central location, and then try and work hard to share these findings regularly and in different formats. A lot of my work, at least initially, was essentially, if we sort of distill it down, was focused on three different layers: the content, the words, images, and the other assets, the design, the use of color, layout, and typography, and the code, which I've mentioned. So that's the underlying, the HTML, the CSS, and JavaScript that is used to create pages. Outside of this, I also helped with training and internal process improvement alongside various colleagues in NHS Digital. And that's just to name a couple of things. So we've looked at context, team structure, and purpose, and some of the day-to-day. Now let's take a look at some of the specific challenges that were faced on the test and trace program. Challenges can be kind of grouped, I suppose, into three themes, broadly speaking. There was context, there was capability, and there was priority. And we'll look at these in more detail now. So the first challenge was the environment that the inclusive design and broader delivery teams work within. Many of you will probably remember that the policies around COVID changed very often. What this meant was that as the teams and individuals had to react very quickly. We had to change, for example, web pages and online forms, sometimes in a matter of hours. And in the process, accessibility wasn't always considered at the outset. And what this meant was that it was also harder for teams to learn and to improve to reflect and iterate effectively. And so we found that there was a sort of pre-existing backlog of issues to deal with. But it was also quite hard to prevent new issues being added to that at times too. Another challenge that it's really important for me to recognize is that teams had to work quickly. So they often didn't necessarily have the time or tools to effectively prevent accessibility issues from being created. This is especially true before the inclusive design team had been set up and started to properly establish itself. So while I do mention issues being created, I want to certainly recognize the very challenging environment that lots of my colleagues worked in. Another challenge, quite frankly, was a sheer number of people, teams and tools and documents. So like when I started, orientating myself was quite daunting, frankly. It felt like there were almost whole cities of different Miro boards to wade through and get to grips with. And I think I might have had between 10 and 15 different passwords for different systems for test and trace alone. Now on screen, I'm showing 3 circles. We've got skills, understanding and experience overlapping to convey a very simple summary of this idea of capability. And this was another challenge. There was a mixed capability across the program with regards to accessibility and inclusion more broadly. And this is not a specific issue for test and trace. It's actually a worldwide issue, recognized that there are low levels of accessibility capability. And just to push this point home a little bit more, there's an annual WebAIM survey of the top million websites, and that shows 96.8% of homepages had automatically detectable errors. So a tool runs across these websites and found 96.8% of them had issues. So it's a big challenge. Near the introduction, I mentioned the excellent foundation that the Government Digital Service had created to support public sector teams to build services in a user-centered manner. And one of the issues was that there was a general lack of awareness around the pre-existing principles, guides, patterns, and code that was in theory available to teams, and in particular, the government design system. So in theory, this design system provided teams with code snippets, guidance on usage, user insights, and accessibility information to build highly accessible multi-step services rapidly. But what we found is teams often didn't use this code or weren't aware of it, meaning much of the accessibility value that had been built in was actually getting a bit lost in the process. And then we also found there were kind of the same top 5 or so issues that kept on recurring as time progressed. So issues were being introduced during design and build and were actually going live while the inclusive design was still establishing itself. Having completed some more in-depth audits based on the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines and some other similar reviews of services that were more structured, we found a reoccurrence of the same issues over time. And I've collected these in some recent analysis. So I'll just run through a few of these now. We found that the HTML structure and semantics was not always reflecting the intent of the content. HTML similarly wasn't validating correctly. Autocomplete wasn't being used on form inputs, so it meant it was longer and slightly less simple to enter data. And we had a few different content design challenges as well, in particular, the way that links were being written. We had links opening in new windows, for example, without warning the user. I won't go into too much more detail about these things, though, because you're going to hear more detail about building accessible forms from my colleague, Ronnie Hendricks, tomorrow. So another challenge was it could be slow to get issues that had been identified fixed. So issues that had been identified had to go through different teams and committees who would then try to decide what would happen first. So you could have, say, a set of 7 accessibility issues, but they were being weighed up against the whole other set of, for example, security updates or bug fixes. So prioritization was a real challenge, and we found accessibility was often getting moved or held in the backlog. So with all those various sections I've covered in mind, what was my initial approach to tackling them? There were some sort of key strands to my initial approach. I wanted to make sure I increased mine and the team's visibility. We needed to let people know we were there and that we were a resource and could offer support. Initially, I kind of focused on providing more ad hoc or reactive support to teams. So sort of fielding questions about prototypes via email or Slack or Microsoft Teams. There's a section of discovery. So what I needed to do is review any accessibility work that had been done before me, and to start to build up a more structured plan for the more in-depth audits and reviews, the more kind of structured work. Now we'll look a little bit about how this approach started to mature, how we began to improve the way we tackled issues. As the approach matured, what we were really doing is focusing both on helping to fix issues, of course, but also to crucially prevent them. And Carl Groves, who's a leader in the accessibility field, has a really great term that I lent upon when speaking with teams, and that's about shifting left or shifting consideration left. And what this is about is helping individuals to consider accessibility earlier and earlier in their design and build process. If you only ever take a compliance-focused approach, this generally means doing a small amount or the smallest amount you can kind of get away with. It tends to mean leaving issues at the end of the process and treating accessibility only like a checklist alone. And it's something we've mentioned in previous talks, but this not only results in clunkier or less graceful solutions, it rarely makes space for true inclusive design in that you don't have the time to involve users with disabilities or other lived experience. This gets squeezed out, but also it tends to cost a lot more or be less efficient as well. So a key motto that we were using and repeating to teams was this idea of shifting consideration left. And to continue on this kind of theme, for what we were doing is moving from the messier ad hoc starting point. We began to identify themes of issues and start to turn issues into improved practices. So we were able to also identify different opportunities to improve any pre-existing processes. Another way of putting this is that we managed to take a bunch of raw data about accessibility across the program, start to turn this into more useful information and ultimately into linked up insights. And we could then use that to improve capability. We could kind of feed those insights back into our planning and iterate. And when I was thinking about this talk, I thought perhaps on reflection, a way of terming some of this is that I was doing support, I was supporting colleagues, and I was balancing the practical with the strategic, but also the realistic with the ambitious. So on any given day, I might be helping answer questions and turning around quick tasks alongside gathering data, learning about processes and building a more strategic roadmap in the background. So sort of flexing between one mindset almost and another. So now I'm going to look at some of the ways we focused on raising capability across the program. So while we'd started to make an impact in helping smaller teams and individuals with maybe some more specific challenges, we certainly recognized the need to complete some more formal training. And the objective being to establish a kind of more consistent baseline understanding of accessibility and inclusion for wider groups. In particular, those who were not necessarily directly involved in the delivery of services. So what we did is we initially ran accessibility and inclusion fundamental sessions. And these were typically between 1 and 2.5 hours. And they focused on the different types of disabilities, different ways users with disabilities may interact, assistive technologies such as screen readers, which I mentioned earlier, or voice recognition software, screen magnification softwares. We also realized we needed to reiterate the standards and guidelines that teams should be working to, but also moving beyond a focus on compliance alone. These were generally well received, and they certainly helped establish a shared vocabulary around accessibility and inclusion. They also helped people to better consider how different users might interact with their service and what good looked like for services as well. To complement the fundamentals training, we also created role-specific training. So this, the difference with this type of training was it provided more practical skills that people could apply in their day-to-day. For example, it included ways to design and test with inclusion in mind, some key methods to avoid the introduction of barriers, and also how this activity can fit into existing processes. And the reason for this is even if teams had an idea of what good looked like, they often didn't know how to actually test an interface, for example, or what quality assurance processes to follow, or what tools to use. Alongside this, I created a series of checklists for each individual role, which could then be referred to while people designed and built web pages. A couple of examples of the checks included in these checklists would be, can you complete all of the tasks using your keyboard alone? Can you understand all information and use all functionality while you're zoomed in up to 400% on the content? And another example was, were all the error messages easy to understand? Did they help the user to prevent and recover from errors? We also completed clinics, so unlike formal training, we ran these as a regular open slot in the diary for people to come along to discuss accessibility and inclusion. Sometimes people would ask specific technical questions. Sometimes they were more general. The key thing is that all people were welcome. There was no specific agenda, and they were intentionally more informal. A couple of examples of sessions include a session focused on guidance for testing interactive prototypes with a screen reader. So what were the shortcut keys you might use to navigate around? What was the audible experience of moving through a web form? And we also had a session focused on the public sector accessibility regulations and the government service standard. So these were some of the standards I mentioned before that were really important for people to understand applied to their work. While we received some really great feedback from this various training and written guidance created throughout the program, we did notice there were some really specific topics people were finding hard to grasp. And this was specifically around how to correctly structure HTML and the use of ARIA, which is an HTML-like code for complex components in the context of COVID-related web forms. And we were able to identify that this was a challenge for people through a few different channels, essentially. We found that the issue was reoccurring in formal audits and reviews. The question was reoccurring during formal training, and it was even cropping up in these clinics I've mentioned as well. So what this boiled down to is, in spite of best efforts to write really clear guidance and provide the kind of tools to complete this work, it hadn't quite landed. So what I did is worked on the creation of some videos. On screen, I'm showing a couple of examples, screen grabs of videos that I published online into a sort of wiki, which covered a couple of topics. What I realized is by creating a video, we're much more easily able to show a cause and effect between the correct code and the improved experience for assistive technology users. Essentially, the video painted 1,000 words, I guess is one way of putting it. I'm just going to have a little drink of water, so bear with me. So far, much of the focus has been on technical capability. But what we realize is that with all the knowledge and skills in place, if people weren't inspired to act, then progress was always going to be limited. So we set about setting up a community, and I supported colleagues in building this new community. We essentially needed to win both hearts and minds to make a true impact on how people were approaching inclusion. And while I didn't lead this initiative, I helped to run it. And the community was called the Inclusive Design Champions Network. It met regularly and included colleagues from all over in the end, including UK HSA, NHS Digital, and various partner agencies. And the key objectives for it initially were to build a network of advocates, to provide a place for people to help each other, to ask questions and share ideas. And there were three core strands to it, really. There was the Human Stories series, and this is where we invited guests to speak about their lived experience of the pandemic and what it meant to them as someone with a disability. We also had knowledge sharing sessions on specific topics, including the social model of accessibility and related models, and they were there to frame thinking around disability. And we also had inclusive content design research sessions. So this was around how some colleagues of mine had approached creating content in the easy read format and how they made use of collaborative or co-design techniques. And then the third strand was about meeting up regularly to plan for future network events, how we could iterate and improve the sessions based on feedback we were gathering from attendees. The community in particular accelerated a culture of inclusion and was certainly one of the great successes. We saw this kind of feedback loop between the theoretical and the insights, the human insights gained at these network events. And they were sort of amplifying the quality of ideas and questions raised in clinics and other more practical settings. And it also helped to raise the visibility of the team across the program, which was something we knew we needed to improve in the earlier stages of the team. So at this point, let's look at a summary of what went well. Well, as I mentioned, the clinics, they were a key part of improving capability and were certainly a success. And I think on reflection, some of the reasons that I think that this is the case, they provided an opportunity for people to ask questions outside of large groups where they might be more fearful perhaps to speak up and ask questions. They helped to delve into specific issues in more detail than broad training could always support. Some of the themes which emerged also directly fed back into more formal training and the creation of resources. So for example, we would use insights from clinics to drive which video assets we created or which changes we made to online documentation. And the other thing is that they seem to increase the chance of inclusive design thinking earlier in the process. So they supported this idea of shifting left, because I think people could bring more roughly formed ideas to the table. They didn't necessarily feel that they needed a very specific brief to bring to the table. And then the other thing is the Champions Network. So again, you may not be surprised that I'm mentioning this was certainly a success as well. It helped to reduce biases in my team and broader teams by bringing in external speakers to tell us about their lived experience. They also provided a forum to get some rapid and rich feedback and insights about services we were building, as long as the people who were joining us were happy to provide that input. They helped to inspire and educate this broad audience who were very receptive to the information in this format. And again, they helped to solidify the guidance and the training and the documentation that I've been creating. So for example, again, when I spoke with people about their prototypes, we noticed once people had attended Human Stories events, that the quality of conversation and the consideration around designs was much richer. And then, so squeezing impact from work. So my team was careful to consider how we would get the maximum impact from any work completed. And I think generally we were quite successful there. So by this, I mean, wherever possible, we considered how can we get more value out of any work that we completed? And a couple of examples include, we always recorded our sort of video conference events. And we also created transcripts and wrote follow-up emails with links and other takeaways from these sessions. And what this ensured is that people could go back and watch these events asynchronously. They could read the transcripts and related information after the fact. And this information, again, would always be uploaded to a central location for longevity. By considering the formats and channels for all work, I think we were better able to amplify its impact. This also helped to mitigate some of the challenges around quite a high turnover of people on the program as well, because there are various formats of information that people could draw upon. The other thing is that we worked hard to combine completing work with upskilling or training and collaborating with colleagues. So rather than completing work in isolation, we often look for opportunities to complete tasks in pairs or small groups, or invite colleagues from wider within UK HSA. And we did try to take a very user-focused approach to the prioritization of any work. So we based the work we completed as much as possible on the real or assumed impact on users as well. So that's some of what went well. Now we'll look at a few themes for things that didn't go so well. One of the things is we found that developers weren't using the accessible code directly from the government design system. As mentioned, many of the challenges of designing and building easy to use public facing services had been solved and iterated by GDS since 2010. Through my time on Test and Trace, I noticed a pattern whereby code which looked like the GDS design system was being used in services, but it didn't match it under the hood. Various development teams worked on Test and Trace. Some were sort of close to replicating the quality of code, and others were much further away. And they might have created, for example, semi-correct variants of it. Sometimes it was only partially styled to look similar visually. And this was a shame, because it meant that a lot of the accessibility which had been built in was lost in the process. But again, I'm keen to point out that there are, of course, various reasons for why this might be. The speed that people had to work, as mentioned earlier. There was also limited formal onboarding or design system specific training for those on Test and Trace. And I think there may have also been an assumption that if something looked like the government, that its quality was the same. And this is actually an ongoing challenge for accessibility, in my view, in that it's not always obvious on at a surface level that accessibility is lacking or that there are issues. The surface level review, of course, does not tell the whole story. We also, across various reviews and audits and analysis, found that the same top 5 issues continued to reoccur. I personally would have liked to have seen better progress here, but up until my last few days, there were still some issues around the correct implementation of HTML and semantics, the use of ARIA, which I mentioned before, which helps to improve interfaces from an assistive technology point of view using HTML and JavaScript, and then content design. And I think I may have mentioned that it was particularly around the way to use links in interfaces. And that's just to name a few examples. One thing I can say, which is more positive, is that we were able to start recommending that teams introduce automated tools which could address some of these issues more efficiently. And then another challenge was around the way that we use systems and how well integrated the systems were and whether they were always appropriate for our role. So as my UK HSA team was separate from NHS Digital, sometimes it wasn't always easy to share resources to collate information into a single source of truth. While there was generally strong support from senior stakeholders in UK HSA and NHS Digital, we hadn't aligned accessibility and procurement and IT as well as more mature departments have been able to do. So was a challenge. Now we're moving into the final section, and I'm really pleased to say we'll look at some of those key lessons that were learned overall during my time. And the first one is, on reflection, I think one of the key things is do not reinvent the wheel. So if you're working on public sector projects, be really aware of the vast amount of pre-existing resources that are available to you. Reach out to colleagues in the public sector if you can, and recognize that design and code, which has already been tested and built and iterated, will save lots and lots of time and money over creating new solutions. And then use this time that you've saved to solve the more tricky user problems. The other more personal lesson that I learned is to allocate approximately 10 to 20% of your time to communications and internal and external PR. I'm quite sort of happy to admit that my head was often in the detail or in the weeds, as people sometimes say, which meant that I was doing, I like to think, important work, but people weren't always aware of it or its impact. In retrospect, I should have been more disciplined about spending a chunk of time each day, or at least each week, sending out summaries and, in particular, internal communications to increase the visibility of the accessibility and inclusion work and its vital role in this program. And the last one is be kind. Now, one of the successes of my time was definitely how kind everyone was to one another. And I know this might sound wishy-washy, but I don't think that undermines the reality of the fact. It was incredibly important during quite a difficult time. In my role, a lot of my time was also spent essentially finding issues with other people's work. So if I delivered this in a supportive and non-judgmental way, you can imagine it's easier for everyone. But not just that, it's about being kind to yourself. So trying to plan carefully to ensure that you protect your own time when working on this type of high pressure project. That includes leaning on colleagues to help reduce and share workloads, but also being really picky about what you choose to focus on. Try to focus on the work which is going to have the most impact for users. Now, I'd just like to round up the talk by just a few personal thanks. You will have heard me referencing both myself and also we and my team throughout the presentation. The reason for this is that I couldn't have achieved any of the activity that I've run through today without the incredible support of a number of fantastic colleagues within Test and Trace. I really had hugely supportive team, very knowledgeable, and just a fantastic support network. So all of those people I'm thanking, I hope will, if they're watching, will know who they are. So, but just time to say thank you very much. And that brings me to the end of the presentation. Thank you so much for listening.
Awesome, thanks, Joel. It's an amazing story of collaboration, and I love particularly the Champions Network that you're part of fostering. If anyone has any questions, please do submit them. I think there's a few trickling in now. But Joel, I mean, going back to kind of this Champions Network, kind of when that was first kind of set up, kind of how was the uptake of that kind of from those outside of kind of, say, accessibility practitioners, kind of, for example, content designers or visual or UX designers? And do you have any tips on kind of, getting those who, aren't necessarily kind of at the coal face of accessibility work kind of more engaged in accessible and inclusive practices?
Yeah, it's a really key question. I think that there's definitely a few strands to it. So, I mean, as I say, I was certainly more supportive initially, although I did take more of a leading role towards the end. But yeah, definitely initially it was one of my colleagues, Catherine, who really sort of spearheaded it, and it was clear it was a huge passion of hers. So she was definitely the right person to kick that off. So, I mean, one thing I kind of answered the question as I've been speaking there. One thing is kind of you want to have someone who loves networking and is hugely passionate as the person spearheading it, as obvious as that sounds, because their passion will radiate, and that's one of the key things that gets people to attend events is how sort of inspiring and charismatic the person setting those meetings up initially are. Of course, that's not a prerequisite, but it certainly helped in this instance. I think more importantly, I mentioned about kind of using your leaning on the public sector network or speaking to people who've already solved challenges or completed work. Well, that's exactly what we did with the Champions Network. So Catherine spoke to Al Duggan, who of course we know well. She also spoke to some other colleagues within the public sector. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's Craig Abbott, who I believe used to work at Co-op. Apologies if I'm not correct there, and may have also worked at DWP or another public sector department. She called upon various people who'd set up similar networks and did a kind of information gathering exercise. So she was able to take all of their brilliant advice and then apply that to the Champions Network. So that was a really great kind of starting point from which to work. In terms of, I guess, engaging people who weren't maybe directly involved in accessibility or weren't directly delivering services, I think the key was leaning on the human storied element of it. So when you make it about personal stories and less about the technicality, I think you immediately open up the information to a broader group. So I know that Catherine worked very hard on the crafting of the invitation emails themselves and really emphasizing the value in terms of what you're going to hear in terms of personal insights, rather than maybe focusing too much on technicalities. The other thing, which I hope I touched upon in the talk, was around how you use internal channels to increase the visibility of certain messages you want to convey. So again, what we were really trying to do was, if we were in a clinic, for example, with maybe a group of 6 people, we would cross-sell the Champions Network and vice versa. So if we're in the Champions Network, we do little asides to the clinics. So it's about almost using every opportunity where you had people's headspace and attention to push these kind of opportunities and messages that you wanted to convey, really. I hope that kind of answered the question.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Yeah, we've had a question that actually came in kind of during that, which I think you answered just then at the end, which is brilliant. That kind of how you got the word out. Awesome. So on to our questions. So we got a couple of questions on kind of user research and kind of including kind of vulnerable or kind of vulnerable kind of groups in the kind of design and development process. Would you be able to speak a bit about that?
It wasn't my specific area of expertise, if I'm totally honest with you. I had a team of user researchers alongside me who kind of led that work. So that might be one potentially better for us to follow up on in writing, because I can potentially provide more accurate answers to that. Brilliant.
Awesome. Thanks, Joel. Yeah. If you are interested, just drop us an email at hello@nomensa and I'm sure we can answer that. So we've got a question here around kind of the what kind of automation tools were used.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah, definitely one of my more recent areas that I've been sort of quite interested to explore more. There's a few different tools. I mean, one thing I will say at the outset is we were at pains to make it really clear to teams that automated tools will only ever identify it changes depending on the user research, the research that you look at, but let's call it around 20 to 30% of issues at best. So that's only a small section of the total number of accessibility issues. So one of the things we did is we actually were very careful about when we spoke with teams about introducing automation, because we didn't want them to have a too high a level of confidence in what those tools could offer. So I will stress that now as well. That said, once we've kind of been through the process of showing teams how to complete manual, more in-depth checks, one of the tools that we introduced on the international arrivals service was something called Pally, which is a kind of, if I remember correctly, it's a JavaScript library that will run through your code, either while you're developing or while you push the code from your kind of local machine into a test environment, for example, or a staging environment. And it will run through a whole set of a rule set, essentially, and we'll do lots of automated checks against your HTML, for example. So Pally is one of the tools that I can recommend. And as I mentioned, what this did was not necessarily kind of provide a kind of catch-all solution for people, but it did help to increase the efficiency of some of those issues that were being missed kind of over time and were easy for a tool that didn't have context to raise as an issue. One of the things to look at essentially is what is within the rule set, and whether, so sometimes automated tools will throw up a lot of false positives or negatives. I always get that wrong, but a lot of false kind of issues for you. So there's potentially also a process of tweaking the tool to match your particular setup as well. But yeah, you can look at Pally is one example.
Brilliant, thank you. So we've got a question here from Rosie, I think around the instructional videos that you mentioned. Are these kind of publicly available, or were they kind of specific to test and trace, and are they shareable at all?
Unfortunately, because they can sometimes contain sort of specific issues that were specific to test and trace, I didn't at the time kind of get around to getting authority to share them further afield. What I probably can do, though, is I imagine I can find some equivalent videos that are already available that do a similar job to what I was covering. These were a bit rough and ready, if I'm honest with you as well. So I can probably find some slightly smarter versions. So again, if you leave your details with Henry and the team, then I'm more than happy to send you some examples of similar videos for you.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, no, we've also had another question, kind of asking for dev teams with not much expertise or time to create accessibility training. Are there any external resources you would recommend? Which I suppose kind of ties into that also. Yeah,
there's loads. Yeah, we've got a whole kind of library, I think, here at Nemensa within the accessibility team. So again, I'm happy to follow up with some links, but in case that doesn't happen, let me just try and think of some key resources. So let me just think. So one of the things I would probably recommend is there's someone called Rob Dodson. I think he works at Google. He has a series of short instructional videos, funnily enough, called AliCast, if I remember correctly, on YouTube. Really good. He's probably one of the best people who explains quite complicated ideas in really simple to understand language. And he's also, because he works for Google, he's also quite up to date with what the latest tools and techniques are that are available for modern web development. So Rob Dodson, certainly a good starting point. And trying to think what else here. So if you're interested in more in-depth kind of an online course, there is also a course at Udacity, which I believe is still free, which is probably maybe around a couple of months, but goes through in much more detail around HTML, CSS, and JavaScript for front-end developers specifically, with live interactive demos and videos, and that's really quite in depth. So those are probably the two key things I'd recommend at this point.
Thanks, Joel. Also, yeah, we can tweet those out and post those on LinkedIn as well. So we've got a couple of questions here, just asking kind of why it kind of wasn't possible to create an accessible template for all kind of NHS websites or different kind of departments kind of within NHS and UK HSA, which I'm guessing is kind of a GDS question.
It was not so much a GDS question. So yeah, no, happy to sort of expand on that a little bit more.
Cool.
Essentially, I mean, basically the answer is I don't know for certain. But throughout the presentation of what I suppose was doing is hinting at potential challenges around that. So I think there were a few potential challenges. One was that the teams that were developing services were having to do so under intense pressure. I mean, they were having to turn around services probably the fastest they've ever had to do so in their lifetime. So there was a challenge around speed versus quality. The other thing I think I mentioned was that not just that, but because of the nature of the surrounding policy changing very regularly, even if something had been built, say, with a certain level of quality, it may then be changed and an accessibility issue is then being introduced. I think there were some challenges around, there was a highly inconsistent knowledge of the pre-existing GDS resources. So some of my colleagues, for example, within NHS, were much closer to the government and public sector standards and guidance because the NHS has created their own design system driven by the government assets, essentially. So they were closer to it, perhaps, generally, whereas other partners and other colleagues were perhaps less aware of the pre-existing resources. And so we're almost not realizing what they were not making the most benefit from, essentially. So I think that there were a few different challenges. But as I say, what I hope is that if some people see this presentation, they'll be better equipped then to kind of make more use from these pre-existing resources.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's amazing kind of to look back now, like kind of remembering the kind of the situation we're in kind of 2 years ago, and the speed that this had to be rolled out is it's amazing.
Absolutely.
So we've got time for just one more question. And this question asks, what were some of the differences to the design and development process once you had shifted consideration left?
Yeah, okay, that's a great question. So I guess there are a few different things. We found that teams, which is exactly what we wanted to happen, teams started to bring their prototypes to us earlier. So we had a more kind of collaborative approach between, for example, myself and my colleague and interaction designers or content designers. So we would start to get involved to the planning stages, for example, of a new prototype. We were able to feed in requirements at earlier stages. People would more proactively ask us if we could run, for example, a screen reader or check an interface in high contrast mode. So that's some of the examples. Before designs even reached the code stages, I also quite often was able to annotate flat designs with feedback as well. So even earlier in the process, in some cases. For some of the interaction designers I work really closely with, we even started to work on the creation of acceptance criteria. So we were able to take some of these individual checks that I mentioned, which were kind of driven by the web content accessibility guidelines, and actually create written acceptance criteria right at the outset for certain pieces of work, which would then be fed into the online kind of tickets within Jira and those sorts of things. So essentially, the main changes were that we were engaged more proactively earlier in the process. And I guess relating to that, we were better able to plan our time ahead of the fact. So things became less reactive and more proactive. So working again with colleagues, we had a much better handle on our backlog and the prioritization around activity as well.
Thank you, Joel. Also, no, thank you. That was a brilliant talk. And yeah, thanks everyone that tuned in also. We are going to be back later on this afternoon with the Ministry of Justice Accessibility team at 1 p.m. UK time. And also Laurie Samuels, Senior Director of Accessibility at NBC Universal at 3 p.m. UK time. We will, endeavour to kind of share those resources ASAP. We'll post them on our social channels. And we'll hopefully see you all back for our talks a bit later on this afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.